The book came in with a donation of about 40 others, water-stained and outdated. The kind of batch a library takes in knowing most of it will end up in the discard pile. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I was sorting them at the back desk of the Portland Public Library, checking each one for condition and duplication, when I opened a battered copy of A Wrinkle in Time and a folded piece of paper fell out onto the desk. I almost didn't unfold it. Old library books have things in them all the time. Receipts, bookmarks, pressed flowers, grocery lists, the small archaeology of every person who ever borrowed them. I have found love letters and to-do lists and a $50 bill once. So a folded piece of paper was nothing unusual, and I nearly set it aside in the little pile of found objects I keep for a week in case anyone comes looking. But something about the fold stopped me. The specific way it was folded, in thirds, then in half a small tight rectangle. I knew that fold. I had not seen that fold in 25 years, but my hands knew it before my mind did, the way your hands know a childhood phone number your memory has lost. I unfolded it, and there, in handwriting I had not seen in a quarter of a century, handwriting that had once been the most important handwriting in my entire life, handwriting I had memorized as a child the way you memorize a face, were words written directly to me. Not to a stranger, to me, by name. Claire, it began. If you're reading this, then the books finally found their way to you, which I always hoped they would. I sat down. I had been standing at the sorting desk, and I sat down in the chair behind it. Because my legs had stopped being reliable. I want to tell you what that note said. I will tell you every word of it, I promise. I have it memorized now the way I once memorized all the others. But to understand what it meant, to understand why a folded piece of paper in a discarded library book made a 39-year-old woman sit down because she could no longer stand, I have to take you back 28 years, to the worst years of my life, and to the notes that got me through them, and to the question I carried for 25 years and never thought I would answer. Welcome back to Still Standing Stories, where the women who were saved by someone they never got to thank finally find out who it was. If someone once got you through the dark and you never knew their name, if you have ever wished you could go back and thank the person who saved you, this story is for you, and I need you to hear all of it. Subscribe before we go further, because who wrote those notes, and why, and what she knew about me before I knew it about myself, is the most quietly devastating thing I have ever learned, and I want to walk you through every year of the not knowing before I read you what was in that last note. My name is Claire Donnelly. I'm 39 years old, and I'm a librarian in Portland, Maine. I have been a librarian for 14 years, and I want you to hold that fact, librarian, because it is not a coincidence, though I did not understand that it wasn't a coincidence until a note in a discarded book explained it to me. Some people become what they became because of a door someone held open for them. I was one of those people. I just didn't know who had been holding the door. When I was 11 years old, my father died. I want to build those years for you carefully, because they are the ground everything else grew out of, and because I think a lot of you have your own version of them. My father died of a heart attack when I was 11, sudden, no warning, here on a Tuesday and gone on a Wednesday, the way it happens sometimes, the way it happened to us, and my mother, who had loved him completely, did not survive it. I don't mean she died. I mean the person she had been did not survive it. She was still there, physically, in the house, but the light in her went out, and it stayed out for years, and she descended into a depression so deep and so total that she was, for most of my adolescence, simply not available, not cruel, not absent in the technical sense, just gone behind her own grief in a way that left an 11-year-old, and then a 12-year-old, and then a 13-year-old, essentially alone in a dark house with a mother who could barely get out of bed. I became very young, the kind of child who takes care of herself. I made my own meals. I got myself to school. I did my own laundry, forged the signatures on my own permission slips, learned to move quietly through a house where noise felt dangerous because it might disturb the fragile, terrible quiet my mother lived inside. I want to be clear that I do not tell you this for pity. I tell you this so you understand what home was. Home was dark and silent and lonely, and there was no adult in it who could see me. I was 11, and then 12, and then 13, and no one in my life could see me. Except that someone could. I just didn't know it yet. I want to tell you about that house because I summarized it in a paragraph, and it was not a paragraph. It was 5 years, and the people living inside their own dark house right now deserve the honest version of what it does to a child. The thing nobody tells you about a parent lost to depression is that it is a bereavement without a funeral. My father died, and there was a service and casseroles and people saying they were sorry. And everyone understood that I had lost him. My mother disappeared into her illness, and there was nothing. No ceremony, no acknowledgement, no word for it. She was right there. She got up sometimes. She appeared at parent-teacher conferences twice in 5 years and made it through them. And so, as far as the world was concerned, I had a mother, and there was nothing to grieve, and any child who feels motherless while her mother is alive in the next room learns very fast to keep that feeling to herself, because saying it out loud sounds like an accusation against a woman who is suffering. So I didn't say it. Not once, not to anyone, for 5 years. What the house was actually like. It was quiet in a way that had a texture. The curtains stayed closed, not dramatically, just nobody opened them. And then a season went by, and then it was simply how the house was. The mail piled up on the hall table until I started sorting it at 12, which is how I learned what a shut-off notice looks like. I learned to cook 4 things. I learned that if I did the grocery shopping myself with the money from the jar, the trip was calmer for both of us than if I asked her to come. I got very, very good at not needing anything, because needing things was the one thing that visibly hurt her. I could see it happen, the flinch, the way a request from me would land on a woman who had nothing to give and knew it. So I stopped requesting. By 13, I was a child who had systematically eliminated her own needs from a household in order to keep the last adult in it from breaking further. That is the part that lasted longest, by the way. Not the loneliness ended when the years ended, but the reflex of having no needs followed me into adulthood like a shadow with excellent manners, and I have spent a great deal of my 30s in therapy learning to say, out loud, to people who love me, sentences that begin with I need. It turns out that is a language you have to learn late if nobody let you speak it as a child. And school was worse than the house in one specific way, which was that at school there were other children with ordinary lives, and the contrast was unbearable. Girls complaining about their mothers being annoying. Girls whose mothers packed their lunches with notes in them. I remember a girl in 7th grade being embarrassed because her mom had written, "I love you," on her napkin, and everyone laughing, and me laughing along, and going into the bathroom afterward and putting my forehead against the cool tile of the stall wall, because the wanting was so physical it had a location in my body. That is who was sitting in that corner by the window, not a bookish girl who liked quiet. A child in the middle of a 5-year emergency that nobody had named, who had made herself so low maintenance that she had become effectively invisible, and who had concluded, with the merciless logic of a kid, that the invisibility was correct, that she was, in fact, not the kind of person anyone notices, that this was simply the truth about her, established by evidence. And into exactly that, someone slipped a piece of paper that said, "I see you, and I hope today is easier than yesterday." You have to understand the size of that. It was not a nice gesture. It was a direct refutation of the central belief of my entire childhood. Somebody had looked at the girl who had made herself unnoticeable and had noticed her anyway. Everything I thought I knew about my own visibility in the world was wrong, and here was the proof, folded in thirds in my hands. The place I went to escape the dark house was the school library. I want to tell you about that library because it saved my life before I even knew it was saving my life, and because the woman who ran it turns out to be the whole story, though I would not understand that for 25 years. It was the library of my middle school, and then, because it was a combined campus, my high school, the same library, from 6th grade through 12th, 7 years of my life. And it was run by a librarian named Mrs. Ellis. Margaret Ellis. I want you to remember that name. I did not know Mrs. Ellis well. That is the thing I have to make you understand. The thing that makes all of this so strange and so devastating. She was not a mentor to me in any obvious way. She did not take me under her wing, did not have long talks with me, did not do any of the things you imagine when you imagine a teacher who saves a struggling child. She was a quiet, precise, Somewhat formal woman in her 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and a cardigan in every season. And she ran her library with a calm order that I found, without quite knowing why, enormously comforting. The library was warm and quiet and safe, and it was open before school and during lunch and after school. And I was there every single one of those times for 7 years, sitting in the same corner by the window, reading my way through the entire collection, because reading was the only place the dark house couldn't follow me. Mrs. Ellis and I exchanged maybe a dozen words a week. She checked out my books. She said, "Good morning, Claire," and "Good afternoon, Claire." And when I left, "See you tomorrow, Claire." That was the extent of it, more or less. She was kind in the distant professional way that librarians are kind to all the children who use their library. I did not think I was special to her. I did not think I was special to anyone. I was, as far as I knew, invisible. A quiet girl in the corner who nobody could see, including, I assumed, the librarian who checked out my books. And then, when I was 11, the notes started. I remember the first one exactly. I had checked out a book. I don't even remember which one, that first time. And I took it to my corner, and I opened it, and tucked inside the front cover was a small folded piece of paper, in thirds, then in half, and I unfolded it, and in careful handwriting it said, "The girl who reads in the corner by the window. I hope today is a little easier than yesterday. Someone is near. Keep going. Someone is near. Keep going." I did not know who wrote it. I looked around the library, that first time, trying to figure out who could have put it there. But the library was full of kids and nobody was looking at me, and there was no way to tell. I thought at first that it might be a mistake, a note meant for someone else, slipped into the wrong book. But it wasn't a mistake, because it said "the girl who reads in the corner by the window," and that was me. That was unmistakably me. I was the girl who read in the corner by the window, and someone had noticed, and someone had written to me. Someone could see me. I cannot fully explain to you what that did to an 11-year-old who believed she was invisible. Someone had seen me. Someone knew I existed, knew where I sat, knew, and this was the part that undid me, knew that I was struggling. I hope today is a little easier than yesterday. How did they know yesterday was hard? How did they know any of my days were hard? I had told no one. I had gotten very good at telling no one, at moving through the world as if everything were fine. And yet someone had looked at me, really looked, the way no one at home could, and had seen that I was a child having hard days, and had decided to do something about it. Quietly, anonymously, in a folded note in a library book. The notes kept coming. Not every day, that would have been too much, would have made it into a system I could have gamed or figured out. They came irregularly, unpredictably, tucked into books I checked out, which meant that whoever was writing them knew which books I was taking, which meant they were watching my checkouts, which narrowed it, logically, to someone with access to the library records. But I never let myself fully follow that logic, because I did not want to solve it. I want to be honest about that. Part of me could have figured out it was Mrs. Ellis, probably. If I had really tried, who else knew what I checked out? But I did not try because the not knowing was part of the gift. The notes came from someone who wanted nothing in return. Not even to be known, not even to be thanked, and there was something so pure in that, so unlike everything else in my life, that I protected it by never investigating it. I just received them. For 5 years. Stay with me, because I need to tell you what those notes were, and what they did, and how they got me through the worst years a person can have. They were never dramatic. That is what made them work. Whoever wrote them understood something profound about a struggling child, which is that a struggling child cannot receive grand gestures. Grand gestures are too much. They demand a response. They put the burden back on the child. The notes were small. The girl in the corner, "Your quiet is not invisible to everyone. Keep going. I noticed you've been reading the books about faraway places. There is a whole world out there, and someday you will be in it. Someone is near, keep going. Hard days don't last forever, even when they feel like they will. I promise, someone is near, keep going. Someone is near, keep going." That was on almost every one. I did not understand then that it was a signature, that "someone is near, keep going" was how this person signed their anonymous kindness. I thought it was just a thing they said. It became over 5 years, the most important sentence in my life. On the worst nights, and there were very bad nights, nights when the darkness of that house got into me so deeply that an 11-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 15-year-old had thoughts that no child should have, on those nights I would take out the notes. I kept them all, every single one, in a shoebox under my bed, and on the worst nights I would take out the box and read through them, all of them. And the sentence would be there over and over, in that careful handwriting. Someone is near, keep going. And I would keep going. Literally. There were nights that sentence is the reason I kept going. And I mean that as literally as it is possible to mean anything. I want to give you more of the notes themselves, because I quoted 3 and there were dozens. And what I understand now, reading them as an adult, knowing who wrote them, is that they were not random encouragement. They were a curriculum. She was teaching me something, one note at a time, over 5 years, and she built it in an order. The first year's notes were all about being seen. That was all they did. The girl in the corner by the window, I hope today is a little easier than yesterday. You're not invisible to everyone. I notice you were here before school again this morning. I hope the day is kind to you. Nothing more than that. I see you, you exist. Someone knows you're there, because that was the first thing an 11-year-old who believed she was invisible had to be given, and nothing else could be built until that was in place. The second year's notes started giving me a future. This is the part that guts me now, because she was reading my checkouts and using them. I noticed you've been reading the books about faraway places. There's a whole world out there, and someday you will be in it. Someone is near, keep going. You've read everything we have on the sea? Someday you should see one. I think you will. She had figured out from nothing but a checkout record what I was doing in those books, which was escaping. And instead of leaving me in the escape, she kept quietly insisting that the places I was escaping to were real and reachable and would still be there when I was grown. A child in a dark house does not believe in the future. There is no future. There is only the endless present of the house. She spent a year gently installing one in me. The third and fourth year's notes got braver. Hard days don't last forever, even when they feel like they will. I promise. I want to point out the word promise. She had no business promising an unhappy 13-year-old anything. And she did it anyway, in writing, repeatedly, because she had judged correctly that what I needed more than accuracy was someone willing to stake something on my future. The way you're carrying this will make you strong later, though I am sorry you have to carry it at all. It will not always be you doing this alone. That one I read 100 times. It will not always be you doing this alone. And in the 5th year, the last year, the notes changed again. And it took me 25 years, and her final letter, to understand why. They began to point outward. The world needs people who notice quiet things. You are one. Someday someone will need you the way you need someone now. You will know what to do, because you will remember. There will be another girl in this corner someday. Be good to her. She was preparing me to pass it on. In the last year, having spent 4 years keeping me alive, she started, gently, invisibly, in folded notes to a 15-year-old, recruiting me into the chain. And it worked. I built an entire adult life on instructions I did not know I had received. I have all of them. That is the thing I want to say to anyone whose childhood contained one small saving kindness. I kept every single one, and I have been able to reread the exact words of my rescue for 28 years. The shoebox was under my bed in that dark house. It was in my dorm room. It moved with me to 4 apartments. It is on the top shelf of my closet right now. There were long stretches in my 20s when I did not open it, but I always knew where it was. I have never once in my entire adult life not known exactly where that box was, which tells you what it is. It is not a keepsake, it is the load-bearing wall. Someone was near. I did not know who, but someone was near, and they had told me so, in writing, in a shoebox under my bed, and on the nights when I was most sure that I was completely alone in the world. I had physical proof in my hands that I was not. Someone had seen me. Someone was near. And so I kept going. The notes continued for 5 years, from when I was 11 until I was 16. And then, the summer I was 16, they stopped. I did not understand why at the time, and it frightened me. The last note had not been a goodbye. It had been an ordinary note, keep going, someone is near. The same as always, and then, that fall, there were no more. I checked every book, I checked obsessively, that first noteless fall, opening every book I borrowed and shaking it, riffling the pages, searching, nothing. The notes had simply stopped and I did not know why, and I was afraid I had done something wrong, or that whoever it was had gotten tired of me, or had realized I wasn't worth it after all. That is the logic of a 16-year-old who was raised in a house where love had disappeared once already. I assumed the disappearance was my fault. It was not my fault. I know that now. I know why the note stopped in the fall of my 16th year, and it is part of what the last note explained, and I will tell you, but I have to tell you the rest first. Things got better, slowly, after the worst years. My mother, when I was 17, finally got help. A doctor, medication, the beginning of a long climb back toward being a person. She never fully returned to who she'd been before my father died, but she came back enough. She came back enough to see me again a little in my last year of high school, and we rebuilt something in the years after, a real relationship before she died when I was 31. I forgave her, for the record. Completely. She had been drowning, not neglecting me, and a woman who is drowning cannot save a child, and I understood that as an adult in a way I couldn't as a child. We made our peace. I was holding her hand when she died. That is its own story, but I want you to know it ended well between us. Because the years I'm describing were so dark that you might assume they didn't, and they did. I want to tell you about the 25 years of wondering, because there is a specific way you carry an unpaid debt to a person you cannot identify, and I carried it my entire adult life. It changed shape as I got older. In my 20s, it was mostly guilt, a low, constant, unresolvable guilt that someone had done the most important thing anyone has ever done for me, and I had never said thank you. I used to run scenarios. What if it was a janitor? What if it was another student, some kid whose name I never learned, who was also lonely and thought a note would help? What if the person died, and I never knew? What if I passed them on the street? There's no closure available for a debt to an unknown creditor, and so it just sat there, accruing. In my 30s, it turned into something more like a devotional practice. I stopped trying to identify the person and started, instead, doing things in their honor. Small things, mostly at work. I would notice a kid and think, deliberately, this is for whoever wrote the notes. I paid it into the world in installments because I couldn't pay it back to the account it came from. I know now, because Margaret told me in the letter, that this is exactly what she did with her own debt for 40 years, which means the chain does not just save people, it transmits its own method. I inherited her strategy for handling gratitude without knowing I'd inherited anything. And there was one thing I did that I have never told anyone until right now. Every year, on the first day of school in the fall, I would say thank you out loud. Alone, in my car usually, in the parking lot before work. Just, thank you whoever you were. I started it in my 20s and I never missed a year. I did it because I could not send it anywhere and I needed it to exist somewhere outside my own head. 20-some years of thank yous, said out loud into an empty car, to a person I could not name. I want to tell you what happened on the first day of school this year, because it was 3 weeks after I found the note. I sat in the parking lot the way I always do. And for the first time in my life, I had a name to say. I said, "Thank you, Margaret." And then I sat there in my car and I completely fell apart because it took me 25 years to be able to put the right word at the end of that sentence. And it turns out that the difference between thank you, whoever you were, and thank you, Margaret, is the difference between grief and rest. If you're carrying a thank you with nowhere to send it, I know, I carried mine for 25 years and I know exactly how it sits. And I want to tell you honestly, most people never get what I got. Most people never get the name. But I also want to tell you what I learned in the parking lot this fall, which is that the thank you said into empty cars were never wasted. They kept the debt alive as something warm instead of something guilty. They kept me pointed at the chain. Every one of them was doing its job for 25 years before I ever had a name to attach to it. And I became a librarian. I want to tell you why, because I told myself for years a simple version of the reason, and it was only the last note that revealed the true version. The simple version was, I loved libraries. They saved me. I wanted to work in them. That was true. But there was more to it, a part I hadn't fully articulated even to myself, and Mrs. Ellis, in her last note, named it before I could, which is one of the most unsettling things about the whole experience. That a woman who died 3 years ago understood my own motivations better than I did. I became a librarian because the library was the one place I was ever safe as a child, and some part of me wanted to spend my life making that place of safety for other children. I did not consciously think, when I chose the career, about the struggling kids who would come into my library the way I had come into Mrs. Ellis's. But they came, of course they came. Every library has them, the quiet kids in the corner, the ones who are there before school, and during lunch and after school, the ones for whom the library is not about books but about refuge. I recognized them instantly, always, because I had been them, and I watched over them, quietly, the way, I understand now, I had once been watched over. I did not leave notes. I didn't know, until 3 weeks ago, that notes were part of my own story to repeat. But I did other quiet things. I made sure the difficult kids felt welcome. I learned their names. I kept the library open the extra 10 minutes when a kid clearly didn't want to go home yet. I had become, without knowing it, a version of the person who had saved me. The struggling child had grown up and gone back to hold the door open for the next ones. I just didn't know, until October, who had held it open for me. Let me tell you about the day the book came in, and the note, and what it said. The donation came from an estate, a batch of old books being cleared out, some of them former library books, the kind of thing that happens when someone dies and their family donates their collection. I was sorting them at the back desk, and I opened A Wrinkle in Time, and the folded note fell out, folded in thirds then in half, and I knew the fold before I knew anything else, and I unfolded it, and it said, Claire, and I sat down. Here's what it said. I am going to read you the whole thing, because it is the most important document in my life, and because Margaret Ellis wrote it for exactly this moment, and she deserves to have it read. Claire, if you are reading this, then the books finally found their way to you, which I always hoped they would. I have been gone for some time now. I'm writing this knowing I don't have long, and knowing I will not get to see you find it, and making my peace with that, because some gifts you give without getting to see them received. You taught me that, though you never knew you were teaching me anything. I need to tell you some things, and I'm sorry it took me dying to tell you them, but I was never brave enough while I was alive, and there's a reason for that too, which I'll get to. It was me, Claire. The notes? For 5 years, it was me. I'm the one who left them in your books. I imagine you may have suspected over the years. Or maybe you never let yourself work it out. You were always someone who protected the things that mattered to you by not examining them too closely. And I understood that. So I never revealed myself, but it was me. Every note, the girl who read in the corner by the window. I saw you. I want you to know that you were never invisible. Not for one single day. I saw you the whole time. I had to stop reading the first time at that line. I saw you the whole time. 25 years I had wondered, and here it was in her hand. It was Mrs. Ellis, the quiet formal librarian I exchanged a dozen words a week with, who had seen everything, the whole time. I sat at my desk and cried, and then I made myself keep reading, because there was more. I want to tell you how I knew, because you must have wondered, how did a librarian you barely spoke to know that you were struggling? Know that your days were hard? Know that you needed someone to be near? I knew, Claire, because I had been you. When I was a girl, a little younger than you were when your father died, I lost my mother, and my father disappeared into a grief he never came back from. And I spent my childhood alone in a dark house, learning to take care of myself and move quietly so as not to disturb the terrible silence. I know your childhood because it was my childhood. I recognized you the moment you started coming to the library. I knew that particular quiet, that particular way of making yourself small and self-sufficient, that particular look of a child who has learned that no adult is coming to help. I knew it because I had worn it myself, 40 years before, and I knew something else, which is that I survived my childhood because of a single act of anonymous kindness. There was a librarian. When I was a girl, of course there was a librarian, Claire. It is always a librarian, and she saw me the way no one else could, and she did small quiet things to let me know I was not alone, and those small things are the reason I lived to grow up. I promised myself, when I was young, that I would spend my life passing that gift forward, quietly, anonymously, the way it was given to me, asking nothing in return. You were not the only child I left notes for, over my 30 years in that library, but you were the one who reminded me most of myself. You were the one I watched most closely. You were, if I am honest, the one I was most afraid for, because I saw in you the same darkness I had felt at your age, the darkness that whispers to a child that she is alone and that it will never end. I could not let that darkness have you. So I wrote to you. For 5 years, I wrote to you, to stand between you and that darkness, the way someone once stood between me and mine. I want you to understand what I was learning, reading this at my desk. I had believed, for 25 years, that I was saved by a stranger, someone kind but essentially unknown, a mystery, a benevolent accident. And now I was learning that I had been saved on purpose, deliberately, by someone who had been exactly where I was, who had recognized her own childhood in mine, who had been carrying a promise for 40 years to pass forward the gift that saved her, and who had chosen me specifically, because she saw herself in me and could not bear to let the darkness win twice. I was not saved by accident. I was saved by someone completing a circle that began in her own childhood, decades before I was born. The note went on. You are wondering why the note stopped. The summer you turned 16. I have felt guilty about that for the rest of my life, Claire, because I know how it must have felt to you. I know you well enough to know you probably blamed yourself. Thought you had done something wrong. Thought I had abandoned you. You had done nothing wrong. What happened is that I got sick. The first time that summer, I recovered and lived many more years. But I was away from the library for a long stretch, and by the time I came back, you had graduated and gone. I never got to say goodbye, and I never got to tell you it wasn't your fault that the note stopped. And that has been one of the great regrets of my life. So let me tell you now, across whatever distance this note is crossing, it was never your fault. Nothing about those dark years was your fault. You were a child carrying what no child should carry, and you carried it, and you survived it, and you did nothing wrong, ever. And I am so proud of you I can hardly hold it. I am so proud of you I can hardly hold it. From a woman I thought barely knew me. Reading it, I understood that she had known me better than almost anyone in my life, had watched me for 7 years, had seen my worst years from the outside, had cared about my survival with an intensity I never suspected, all while checking out my books and saying good morning, Claire, and giving no sign. The care had been total, and it had been completely hidden. She had loved me, in a real and specific way, for 7 years, and I never knew, and she never asked me to know. And then the last part, which is the part I can barely read even now. I have one more thing to tell you, and it is the thing I most want you to have. I have been following your life from a distance. Portland is not so far, and librarians know how to find things out about people. It is our particular skill. I know that you became a librarian. Claire, I cannot tell you what that knowledge has meant to me. When I heard some years ago that the quiet girl who read in the corner had grown up to run a library of her own, I wept, because I knew what it meant. I knew you had become what I became. Someone who goes back to hold the door open. The children who hide in libraries, Claire, so often return to keep the library safe for the next ones who need to hide. You did what I did. You completed the circle, the same way I completed it. The same way the librarian before me completed it. All the way back. A chain of us, stretching back further than either of us will ever know, each one saved by the last and saving the next. You're part of that chain now. You have been part of it for years without knowing it. And somewhere in your library right now, Claire, I promise you, there is a quiet child in the corner who is going to grow up and go back and hold the door open because you were kind to them. It never ends. That is the most beautiful thing I know, and I wanted to make sure you knew it before. Well, before. Keep going, Claire. Someone is near. Someone was always near. And now you're the someone. For someone else. With all the love I was never brave enough to say out loud. Margaret Ellis. I sat at the back desk of my library for a long time after I finished reading it that first time. It was October, and the light was going gold, and then gray outside the windows. And eventually one of my colleagues asked if I was all right, because I had been sitting very still for a long time with a piece of paper in my hands, and I said I was. And I was, though I was also completely undone. And both of those things were true. Margaret Ellis died 3 years ago. I looked it up that afternoon after I read the note. I searched her name and found the obituary, and there she was. Margaret Ellis, beloved school librarian for 31 years, died at the age of 78. The obituary mentioned that she had never married, had no children, and had left her entire estate and her personal library to be distributed to public libraries around the state. Which is how a box of her books came to be donated to the Portland Public Library. Which is how A Wrinkle in Time came across my sorting desk on a Tuesday in October. Which is how the last note found me, exactly as she had hoped it would, 3 years after she died, 25 years after she stopped writing. She had written it not knowing when or whether I would find it. She had put it in a book, knowing her books would eventually be given away, knowing they would scatter across the libraries of Maine, knowing that I was a librarian in Maine and she had trusted, across her own death, that somehow someday one of her books with my note in it would reach me. It was the longest shot imaginable. And it worked. The note traveled 3 years and found the one library in the state where the girl she saved now works and fell out of a book onto my desk and said my name. I want to tell you what I did in the weeks after I read the letter, because I did not simply accept it and move on. I'm a librarian. When I need to understand something, I research it. And what I found out about Margaret Ellis in those weeks turned a devastating letter into something even larger. I went back to the school. It is still there, still a combined campus, and the library is still in the same corner of the building, though it has been renovated and the corner by the window is now a bank of computers, which felt like exactly the right amount of loss. I asked to speak to whoever had been there longest, and they sent me to a woman named Dolores who has worked in that building for 34 years and who remembered Margaret immediately and who, when I explained why I was asking, sat down slowly in a chair. Dolores told me things. She told me that Margaret ran that library for 31 years and never once, in all that time, took a personal day for anything except illness. She told me that Margaret arrived at 6:40 every morning to open the library before school, on her own initiative, unpaid, that it was not part of her job and no one had asked her to do it, and she did it for 3 decades. 6:40 in the morning, so that the kids with nowhere to be would have somewhere to be. I did not know that. I want you to understand, I used that library before school for 7 years. And I never once wondered why it was open, or knew that a woman was getting up at 5:30 in the morning to make sure it was. And Dolores told me one more thing. She said that when Margaret retired, the school offered her a party, and she declined it, and instead asked for one thing. She asked whether she could have the old card catalog cabinet, which was being thrown out. They said yes. And I asked why on earth she wanted a card catalog cabinet, and Dolores said she'd asked the same question, and Margaret told her, I kept some things in it. So I did the last piece of research. I contacted the estate, the lawyer's name was in the obituary, and I explained who I was, and I asked, feeling absurd, whether anyone knew what had happened to an old card catalog cabinet. And it turned out that most of Margaret's furniture had gone to a secondhand shop in her town, and it turned out that the shop still had it, unsold, 3 years later, because nobody wants a 100-pound oak card catalog cabinet. I drove 2 hours, and I bought my rescuer's card catalog cabinet for $90, and I opened the drawers in the parking lot of a secondhand store. Most of them were empty, but in 3 of the drawers, filed neatly, in her hand, were index cards. Dozens of them. Each one had a first name and a year range and underneath a few short lines. Danny, 1987, 1990. Father in prison. Wouldn't take food from the cafeteria, too proud. Left notes in the sports books. He graduated. Went into the Navy. Rosa, 1994, 1997. Sister died, stopped speaking for a year. Poetry section, she is teaching now, I'm told. Marcus, 2002 to 2005. I never knew what was wrong, Something was, I hope the notes helped. I never found out what became of him, and I think about him still. There were, I counted, 61 cards. 61 children over 31 years. 61 quiet kids in the corner, each of them given the same 5-year curriculum of folded notes, each of them tracked in a card catalog by a woman who never told a single one of them she was doing it. She kept records the way librarians keep records. She kept a catalog of the children she saved. I found my own card. Of course I did. Claire, Mina 1998 to 2005. Father died suddenly, mother lost to grief. The girl is running that household alone. I'm fairly certain, though she would never say so, reads to escape. The most like me of any of them, I'm more worried about this one than I have been about any child in 20 years. And then, in different ink added later, in a shakier hand. She is a librarian in Portland. She went back to hold the door. I have never been prouder of anything in my life. I sat in the parking lot of a secondhand store in a town 2 hours from my house, in my car, with a card catalog drawer in my lap, holding an index card that said a woman had been more worried about me than about any child in 20 years, and that she had been prouder of my career than of anything in her life, and that she had gone back, after her handwriting had started to shake, after she was already sick, to update my card with the ending. 61 cards. 61 children. And every one of them, I would guess, grew up exactly like me, believing they had been saved by a kind stranger, wondering who, never knowing. There are 61 adults walking around this state right now with their own shoeboxes, and I am the only one who found out. I have thought about trying to find them. I have not decided. Some of those cards say things the person may not want handed back to them by a stranger. But I know their names now. I am the only living person who knows what Margaret Ellis actually did with her life, and I am the keeper of that record, and I take it seriously, and the cabinet is in my living room. I keep the shoebox still. I want you to know that. The shoebox of notes from my childhood. I have kept it my whole life, moved it from apartment to apartment. 30 years of keeping a box of anonymous notes from someone I couldn't identify. And now the last note lives in the box with all the others. And now I know the hand that wrote them all. And I can read them differently, not as messages from a kind stranger, but as letters from Margaret Ellis, who saw herself in me, who had been saved the same way, who spent 7 years standing between me and the dark and never let me know. There is a question underneath this whole story that I have to address, because I wrestled with it for weeks, and I suspect some of you are already asking it. The question is, why didn't she just talk to me? She was an adult. She was a school employee. She had access to me every single day for 7 years. She could have sat down across from a struggling 11-year-old and said, I see what's happening at home, and I'm here, and let's get you some help. Why the notes? Why anonymous? Why spend 7 years standing 3 feet from a child in crisis and never once say it out loud? I was angry about this, briefly. I want to be honest about that, because posthumous revelations do not arrive as pure gratitude. They arrive mixed with everything else. For about a week I was angry that she'd had the answer to my loneliness in her pocket and handed it to me in folded pieces instead of just saying it. Angry that I could have had a person instead of a mystery. Angry that she died 3 years ago and I could have visited her. I could have thanked her. I could have had a friend if she had ever just said it out loud. I worked my way out of the anger, and here is how. First, she told me why in the letter, and I skimmed past it the first several times I read it. I was never brave enough while I was alive, and there's a reason for that too. She never fully explained the reason, but I have thought about it a great deal, and I think I understand. A woman who grew up exactly as I did, alone in a dark house, learning to have no needs, becomes an adult who can give enormously and cannot receive at all. She could not have handled my gratitude. She could not have sat across from me while I cried and thanked her. That is not coldness. That is the specific damage that childhood does, and I have it too. I am right now at 39 in therapy learning to say I need. She never got that. So she gave in the only way she could safely give, which was anonymously, where no one could thank her, where the exchange stayed one-directional and therefore survivable. And second, and this is the part that resolved it completely for me, I asked myself whether the notes would have worked if I'd known. They would not have. I'm certain of it. If Mrs. Ellis had sat me down at 11 and said, "I know what's happening at your house," I would have denied it, and then I would have stopped coming to the library, because the library's entire value to me was that it was the one place nobody required anything of me. The moment an adult named my situation out loud, I would have had to manage that adult's concern, protect my mother from it, perform okayness. That is what a child in my position does. She knew that. She knew it because she had been that child. So she chose the one method that could reach a kid like me, the method that asked nothing back, that could be denied, that let me keep my pride and my privacy completely intact while still telling me, every few weeks for 5 years, that I was not alone. She did not choose anonymity in spite of what I needed. She chose it because of what I needed. It was not cowardice. It was the most sophisticated act of care I have ever encountered, and it was designed specifically for me by someone who had been me. That is what got me out of the anger and into something much bigger. Because once I understood that, I understood the whole shape of what she did. She gave up ever being thanked on purpose, forever. Because being thanked would have made it useless to the person she was trying to save. She traded her own place in my story for the story working. 61 times. There's a word for that, and I have not found it yet. I found her grave. I go now sometimes. I bring nothing dramatic. I am like her, not a dramatic person. I just sit for a while, and sometimes I tell her about the kids in my library, the quiet ones in the corner, the ones I'm watching over the way she watched over me. I told her, the first time I went, about a girl who comes into my library every day after school and doesn't want to go home, and how I've started making sure she knows she's welcome, and how I think I'm going to start leaving her notes, folded in thirds, then in half. Someone is near. Keep going. Because that is the chain, and I'm a link in it now, consciously now, and the girl in my library is going to grow up and go back and hold the door open, and it never ends, and Margaret was right that it is the most beautiful thing there is. I want to tell you about the girl in my library, because I mentioned her briefly, and she is the reason this story does not end with me. Her name is Nadia. She is 12. She has been coming to my library every day after school since February. And she stays until we close, and she does not want to go home, and she has the specific quiet I recognize because I wore it for 5 years. I do not know what is happening in her house. I have never asked, and I'm not going to ask because I know exactly what asking would do. Here is what I have done instead. I have learned her name and I use it. I have made sure she knows the study room at the back is available to anyone, which means she has a door she can close. I keep a basket of granola bars at the desk that is officially for staff and unofficially for anyone, and I have never once looked at her when she takes one. And when we close, I say, "See you tomorrow, Nadia," because I know from personal experience what it does to a kid to be told daily, out loud, that her return is expected. 3 weeks ago, after the letter, after the card catalog, I started leaving the notes. I did it exactly the way Margaret did it. I looked at what Nadia was checking out. I wrote on a small piece of paper, folded in thirds, then in half, and I slipped it into the front of a book she had just borrowed, and I handed it to her, and my hands were not quite steady. And she took it and went to the back, and I made myself not watch. The first one said, "To the girl who reads in the back room, I hope today is a little easier than yesterday. Someone is near, keep going." I want to tell you what happened about 20 minutes later, because it is the single most important thing that has ever happened to me in 14 years of this job. Nadia came out of the study room. She did not have the note in her hand. She'd put it somewhere, in her pocket or her bag, and she walked up to the desk, and she didn't say anything about it, and I didn't either. She just stood there for a second, and then she asked me a question about the return date on something. Some completely invented question that did not need asking. And I answered it, and she nodded and went back to the study room. She just wanted to stand near an adult for a minute. That was all that was. And I understood it completely, because I had done exactly that, at exactly her age, in exactly that way, invented a question so I could stand near Mrs. Ellis for 30 seconds after a note arrived, without ever acknowledging the note, because acknowledging it would have broken the spell. 28 years apart, the same girl, doing the same thing at the same desk. Except this time I'm on the other side of it and I know exactly what is happening and I know exactly what she needs, which is for me to answer the invented question like it is a real one and let her go back to her room with her pride intact. I have left her 11 notes now. I am going to keep leaving them for as long as she needs them. And then she is going to graduate and leave, and I will very likely never find out what became of her. And that is the part I want to end on, because it is the part I finally understand. I will probably never know, that is the deal. Margaret went 31 years and 61 children and only found out about a handful of them. There is a card in that cabinet that says, "I never found out what became of him and I think about him still." That is what this work is. You put something into a child's hands and then they walk out of the building and into a life you don't get to see. And you never learn if it worked. And you do it anyway, 61 times for 31 years. And then you die and your books get donated and one of them lands, 3 years later, on the desk of the one you were most worried about. I have a card catalog cabinet in my living room now. I have started my own cards. There is one in there that says, Nadia 2026 present. Won't go home, reads in the back room. Doesn't know I see her. I see her. And someday, if I get very lucky, a woman in her 40s will open a book, and a folded piece of paper will fall out, and she will sit down because her legs have stopped being reliable. And if I do not get lucky, then she will simply grow up, and be all right, and never know why, and go back at some point to hold a door open for someone else, without understanding where the impulse came from. Both of those are wins. Only one of them comes with an ending, and the ending was never the point. There is one last thing, and then I will let you go. I went back to her grave last week, and I brought something with me. I had been thinking for a while about what you bring to the grave of a woman who spent her whole life refusing to be thanked. And flowers seemed wrong. Flowers are for people who want to be seen, and she spent 78 years arranging not to be. So I brought a note, folded in thirds, then in half. I wrote it the way she wrote hers. Small, not dramatic, nothing that would demand anything from the person receiving it. And I want to read it to you, because it is the only thank you I will ever get to deliver, and because if you're carrying an undelivered one of your own, maybe it will give you an idea of where to put it. It said, Margaret, it worked. All of it. I grew up, and I'm all right, and I have a life. A real one, with people in it who love me and know how to say so, which I'm still learning to let them do. I read your cards, all 61. I know what you did with your life, and I am the only one who knows, and I will keep it carefully. There's a girl in my library named Nadia who won't go home, and I have started leaving her notes. Folded the way you folded them, with your words at the bottom, because I could not think of better ones, and because I want them to keep going. You were never invisible either. I see you. Someone is near. Keep going. I left it under a stone on the corner of her marker. It rained 2 days later, and I know exactly what happened to it. And that is completely fine because the note was never really the point. The note was just what you do with a thank you when the person is gone. You say it anyway. Out loud or on paper, into the empty car or the wet grass. Because gratitude that has nowhere to go does not disappear. It just goes looking for somewhere else to land. And if you're not careful, it lands on nothing. And if you're careful, it lands on the next person. That is the whole thing. That is everything I have. A woman I barely spoke to saw an invisible child and spent 5 years telling her she was not alone, and then never told her, and then died, and then reached across 3 years and a grave to say one more time, I saw you the whole time, and now I'm at a desk in Portland, Maine, folding paper in thirds, then in half for a 12-year-old who thinks nobody can see her. Someone is near, someone was always near. Keep going. If someone once saved you and you never knew who, hear this. The person who got you through the dark, the anonymous kindness you never traced, the stranger who saw you when no one else could. They were not a stranger, not really. They saw you because they had been you. Almost everyone who saves a struggling child was once a struggling child who someone saved. It is a chain, stretching back further than any of us can see, each link saved by the last and saving the next. You may never get to thank the one who saved you. I got a note across 25 years in a grave, and I know how rare that is. But you can do the thing that actually completes the circle, the thing that means more than thanks ever could. You can be the someone for someone else. Find the quiet kid in the corner. Hold the door open, leave the note. You are a link in a chain that has been holding people through the dark since long before you were born, and the most beautiful way to honor the one who saved you is to save the next one. Someone was near, the whole time. And now you are the someone. Keep going. Drop one word in the comments that describes how this story made you feel. Just one word. Tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. Share this with someone who was once saved by a person they never got to thank, because they need to hear that the circle can still be completed. Hit subscribe and I will see you in the next one.